Thank you, everyone. Have a good lunch, I hope. The 175th anniversary committee came to me at one point and wanted a presentation. They were kind of loose on what they were looking for. At one point they said, how about all the buildings in town that used to be there that aren't there anymore? And I said, well, I don't know if people are going to be too excited about things they couldn't see, haven't seen in their lifetime and stuff. Anyways, we settled on a combination of buildings that are gone, buildings that are still here, they're kind of their histories, and some of the stories that go along with them. So that's what the presentation's about. Anyhow, we'll start off with a building that's no longer here. It had kind of an interesting history. In the early 1800s, there was a schism in the Congregational Church, and a group of people broke off and decided to start a Baptist church. Initially, they met over in Tallinn, but in 1831, they decided they needed their own building here in town, so they built this building. You can see it was located across the street from the museum on the lot that used to house the World War II museum, memorial stones. That's how the town ended up with that lot. In 1933, when the WPA projects were coming through, they decided to straighten Route 6. Route 6 at that point in time went down what today is Monument Lane. It used to connect up to Route 6. That was the road, Center Street, through Hebron Road, Lower Center Street, back down in front of the church to where it is today. They straightened it. Well, they needed to get rid of this building in order to straighten it, was the idea. So they sold it to the Boy Scouts for $1. I don't think the Boy Scouts ever got around to taking it down, but the town ultimately got it taken down. In the late 1800s, the Baptists dissolved, and the town did buy the building, and they tore out the pews, and they've used it as a gymnasium. Basketball was played in there for many years, up until about 1932, 33, when, again, it needed to be taken down. The stepping stones that you can see here, that's what the World War II monument was placed on originally. The stone monument was placed on. One of those stones is now over at the museum. We recovered it. Anyways, that was the Baptist church. The original Congregational church, or actually meeting house, was up on Hebron Road. It's a vacant lot between the big white house right at the top of the hill and where the next house over, it's escaping me. Rasan, anyways, there's a vacant lot there. That's where the meeting house stood. After the Baptists built their brand new church building, the Congregationalists decided we're going to lose all our members if we don't build a new building. So the beginnings of the church that's down on Route 6 were started, but they took the material from the old meeting house and built the conference house shortly thereafter. That building was used over the years. It was for town meetings. You can see in this lower picture it was labeled as the library. That was the first library space that was outside of a private house. The library had actually been started 10 or 15 years earlier. It served as a school building for the upper grades, the grades 4 through 8. Again, town meetings, town elections, just about everything until they built the old town hall, which is now the museum. Took place in that building. The town rented it for $20 a year from the Ecclesiastical Society. And again, you can see now it's being used as the pantry. Affectionately known as the Beehive. There's a big white house in the corner of Center Street and Hebron Road. Built in 1784. One of the larger houses in town. It was built by a gentleman who made quite a bit of money in the overseas trade. They traded with China a lot, bringing in China from China. The building at one point had a tunnel that went into the basement, had nothing to do with the Underground Railroad, so anything you read about that is garbage. So it was simply Yankee ingenuity. They needed to bring supplies in because it was an inn. They drove them directly into the basement rather than carry them up and then carry them down. That tunnel was still there in my grandfather's day. It has since collapsed. It's very difficult to even tell where it was from the inside at this point. The picture in the lower right-hand corner is how it looked during the WPA days. Along with road projects and other things, one of the WPA projects was photographing what were considered significant buildings in the towns in the 1930s. You can see it looked rather run down at that point in time. Since then it's been spruced up. Lower left is relatively recent, even though they have redone the walk and so forth in the front. There was also supposedly an oak jail cell in the basement that they used to keep nefarious people. Jeff?
When was the gamma roof house removed?
No idea. That was, in this picture, it's actually labeled post office, but the post office was just wherever the postmaster happened to hang out. It was in lots of different buildings at the center. It was a store. I don't believe that was ever a residence. In this picture, which is probably one of the oldest ones, it's a daguerreotype, probably 1865, 1870 at the latest. Sometime after that, the building was taken down. No idea. I find no references to that building other than this picture. This was the old store in my day, in the center, right across from the old firehouse. When Mr. Standish ran it, was over on the left-hand side. That was a bit before my time. In my time, when I was a kid, it looked like on the upper right-hand corner. It went in those double doors. It had a big freezer in the back. Somewhere along the line, it was remodeled the front to look like it does down here on the right. And you can see very recently it was taken down completely. It just became an absolute shambles. And now it's a vacant lot. But, a lot of activity in that store over the years. It also served as a post office at one point in time. Again, wherever the postmaster was hanging out is where the post office was. Another building that served as a post office. Yep.
Was that previous shop, was that where the store was? Is that what you said, where the store was?
Yes, that was.
Store and the post office both?
Well, again, the post office was wherever the postmaster hung out. So yes, he was operating a store. He also happened to be the postmaster. Not in this, that was pre these pictures. In these pictures, it's just a store. It started out, the old firehouse was a dry goods and clothing store, and this building was more the grocery store, things like that over the years. So we had the two stores either side, supplied generally by the railroad to bring in supplies, and they sold them from there. But yeah, this was, when I was a kid, the market down on Route 6 didn't exist yet. This is where we went. This building also still exists down on Center Street, just the one next to the Beehive. And Morgan Steele's is on the left in the lower picture. This building was the first almost standalone post office. The left-hand side of the basement was a dedicated post office. It wasn't just a cubby hole because that's where the postmaster lived or resided or worked. This one was actually defined as the post office. The woman who ran it lived across the street, Jenny Mercer, in one of the twin white houses at Cider Mill Road. But the other side, the right-hand side, was called the Valley Store. My great-grandfather, Judge Edward Yeomans, ran that. It was just, again, kind of a soda fountain. You'd get penny candy in there. It was a lot like the convenience stores that you have today. But that ran for quite a while. As you can see in the bottom right, they had a gas pump out there. And he used to complain bitterly about people showing up at midnight, 2 o'clock in the morning, demanding to get gas. It wasn't very pleasant with those people. This is the one house in town that's probably got rather international fame. It's also on the historic, the Register of Historic Buildings, National Register, the only one in town. Because it was served as an inn, it was built as a tavern. It had a spring floor upstairs. All the walls were on hinges, so you could attach them, swing them up, attach them to the ceiling. Then you could have a big ballroom upstairs, a spring floor, wood spring floor. But it's also where Count Rochambeau stopped and had lunch when he was coming through, marching through town with his thousands of troops. on his way to help Washington down at Yorktown, and then ate there again on the way back. So that's pretty much its claim to fame. Lower right is what it looks like today. Upper left is when it was owned by a gentleman, Gurley Phelps. He was probably one of the richer people that Andover has ever seen. Had quite the fancy place for his parties. Excuse me?
What road is that?
It's right between Hutchinson Road and Route 6, right where the market is. It's red on this side. I think there's still yellow on the other side that you'd see from Route 6 side. Recently purchased by a religious group, I believe, that uses it as a meditation center.
Yeah, they have a temple there, yeah.
Yeah, because we see them, yeah.
This is the parsonage for the Congregational Church, was called. It was the building that was given to the very first minister when you established an ecclesiastical society, which we did in 1747. One of your first tasks is you had to bring in a minister, you had to build a meeting house, and you had to supply the minister with a home. So the ecclesiastical society purchased this farm and gave it to the first minister as his place to live. The larger picture, you can see it when it was actually facing Long Hill Road. So if you look at the bottom left-hand picture, that's taken from the same spot that the bigger picture is taken from. That building was literally lifted, the L was taken off, lifted, spun 90 degrees, and moved down Route 6 to the west to where it resides today. So that was quite the feat in the day before hydraulic equipment and things. Did it jacks and oxen. The little tiny building to the left in the lower right-hand picture is the old hearse house that used to reside on the grounds of the Congregational Church. Down when they had the horse sheds, the whole back of the parking lot was lined with horse sheds, and it's not where you put your horse, it was where you put your carriage. Keep it out of the weather while you were in the church. The horses were left out in the weather. But that was the hearse house, that's where the horse-drawn hearse was kept. You can see it's a rather skinny little building, and I've had many, or not many, but I've had people over the years wonder why somebody would build a garage so small, because even the first cars would have been a tight fit into that. Well, it wasn't built for that, it was built for a horse-drawn hearse. The railroad station, this one's long gone, torn down in the 1950s, before I was born. It sat right at the apex of Center Street, where the lower Center Street takes a hairpin turn and heads back up the hill. In this day, of course, the part of Hebron Road that we use today between the two Center Streets didn't exist. You went along Main Street or Center Street. You went to here. If you wanted to hit Hebron Road, that was what is now Upper Center Street, was Hebron Road. This station that you're looking at here was built shortly after the 1880 fire took the original station. I do not have a picture nor even a drawing of what the original station looked like. I presume it was pretty similar to this one, but I have diary entries that talk about the fire. You know, passing train in those days, wood burning trains, the embers came out, they set a lot of stuff on fire. This thing caught on fire. They sent engines up from Willimantic, where they had a lot of extra engines, so that they could take water out of the tenders and throw it on the barns. And you didn't try to put out a burning building in those. What you tried to do was save all the other buildings that weren't on fire yet. As you'll eventually see in the very next slide, there was a very substantial building next door, the hotel, and they managed to keep that from burning. By far, this has got to be the largest building that the old Andover ever had. It's amazing to me that we ever had even the train population in order enough to support a hotel like that. But the railroad came through Andover rather early, before a lot of other places got a railroad service. They would get off the train here if they wanted to go to Colchester, they wanted to go to Coventry, you'd get off the train, probably stay a night. Then the far end of the building, you can see where the livery stables are, where they kept the horses and the hay and everything to make the stagecoach run. The stagecoach would then run you to where you needed to go. Jeff?
Is it true that delivery people knocked over a lamp when playing cards and drinking, and that's why it caught fire?
Half true. Yes, and after the hotel had closed, it probably closed in the early 1900s, very early 1900s. The delivery area was wide open, and there was 4 gentlemen who went up there to play cards, got very drunk. They were all locals. And yes, they kicked over a lantern and burned themselves up, as well as the entire building. That made quite the fire. Stories from my grandfather were that the engine crews coming down out of Bolton could see it from Bolton, and they started laying on the horn trying to wake everybody up. The Grange meeting was happening at the old town hall, and they had just broken up, and the first people to go outside said, "Oh my God, what's that?" And they saw the fire, so they all went up and watched it. Because again, pre-fire department, nothing you were going to do to save that building. Again, you started bucket brigades and other things to try to save the buildings around it. But it was quite the substantial building. What I always love about this is you can tell exactly where it is. If you look at this stone here,
Yeah.
it's the exact same stone and arrangement there. So you know exactly where that was. These foundations, this brickwork, is this brickwork. They just built those houses on top of the foundations from the hotel.
This is Lower Center Street?
Lower Center Street, yep. Yeah, the old firehouse is right here, right next to it. So this is the old Baines residence here, and I forget the name of the people that live there, but this is the end of Center Street, Lower Center Street. The new parking lot's right there. This is what beginnings of the town garage started as a paper mill by Fred Case, who was a brother of the Cases in Manchester. So he was not the same as Case Mountain. He was a relative, but not the people that Case Mountain's named after. He had 2 other brothers that did the Case paper mill and the Case everything in Manchester. He had several mills in case he came out here and built one in Andover. This is the original mill here. This had a 24 horsepower water wheel on the end of it. If anybody's walked the Hop River walking trail out there, you'll run into the dam. They used to dam up Hop River, and that dam was built to supply water for that mill. But,
As you go over the bridge and look down the river, you see sticks out into the river.
the concrete part, that was the spillway. That was the spillway for it. That was for the excess overflow water. The actual channel to take water to the mill is a little bit further upstream, off to the left of where you're talking about. That concrete piece, though, was, again, you got water up to only a certain level, and it would run over there and go down the Hop River Channel. And that's what failed in the '38 hurricane. You can see where it broke right off. Apparently, the southern end of that concrete became dislodged from the earthen part that was holding it, and it just wrenched it off. And you can still see all the broken pieces there, but that's what caused us to fail. But by that point in time, you can see they moved to steam. So the new plant was steam powered, not water powered, so you didn't need to fix the dam for any reason. But that used to be a substantial body of water, back to almost all the way up to Burnett Brook Farm. It went quite a ways. And if anybody remembers Percy Cook, he had a brother Morris who drowned in that pond. Another industrial plant that's no longer with us is built as the creamery. Some of you that have been around a while know it as the hippie house. But originally it was made to, they had all the work, made the cream downstairs. They had steam engines, they had churns and so forth down there, work tables to do it. Upstairs was mostly a business area where they had meeting rooms and stuff. After the creamery went out of business, it was eventually bought by a man named Mr. Rosenblum, and he was part of the garment industry in New York. So he continued to travel to New York, but he'd bring supplies out. His family would live here all year long, and they ran a store out of there that basically supplied whatever he brought home from New York. Auto parts, things like that. They had a gas pump right behind where these cars are. I think you can see the top of it right there. So they sold gas. I think I have a picture from the other side. I think it says 24 cents a gallon is what they were paying at those days. This is around 1918, because if you go down to the library and get a book called Everything Happens for the Best by Sarah Winston. She's a young girl who lived in this house. She tells the whole story of Andover in the 1920s. It's a really interesting read. But anyways, what's happening here, you can see the original roof line was way down here, only one set of windows. He's adding on. He's raising the roof line, making it look more like what we remember as the hippie house. They added 12 rooms to the top floor once he bought it, and that's where they all lived. They continued to run the store downstairs, and he lived upstairs long before it became the hippie house, and then ultimately now it's our nice monument area. Another building that's no longer with us is Andover used to be the seat of the probate district for Andover and Bolton. If you were the seat of the probate district, you had to have a fireproof building to keep the records in. So this was our original records building. This is where Carol would have worked in many, many moons ago. That building was still there. I can recollect going in there when I was a teenager. I don't know exactly when it was taken down, but relatively recently, probably 30 years ago, but still relatively recently. It sat right outside the museum. This is the dining hall for the old town hall, so right in this area. Because if anybody remembers, we used to have a fence around the farm equipment out in the back there. When we tried to dig the post holes, we found the foundation for this thing and caused us quite a bit of grief. Andover Lake. Andover Lake, the bottom of it used to be a farm. Used to be good meadow mowing lands. My great-grandmother grew up in this house. It was called Cheney Hollow at the time. Obviously the barn that became the red barn, it's white in that picture. It was moved because you can see here it's out in the water. So again, they jacked it up to keep it out of the water. Eventually they took the farmhouse down and they moved the red barn onto the peninsula. And unfortunately the lake group needed some money, and ultimately they sold it off. It went off to a place like Sturbridge Village and reassembled, I assume somewhere, and a nice new house built on the spot. But I, for some reason, had always been told and thought that this house was taken down before they flooded the lake, but this is obviously incontrovertible evidence that it was still there long after they filled the lake, because they had already started building some cottages and things along the edge before it was taken down. The next one is that farmhouse. You can see this horse. That stone wall is right here. That horse would have been chest deep in water had he been there a few years later. But that's when West Street, West Street just dead ends at the lake, and then you pick up the driveway for that brand new house on the other side. Well, that was all West Street. The whole part of Lake Road that goes from West Street around toward Lakeside Drive didn't exist. That was only built once they created the lake, because they cut West Street off and they had to be able to get around it.
Scott, was there a road that went from that property to west, right through the lake? I thought I remember hearing that.
West Street went across what is now the Cove,
Okay.
crossed Cheney Brook,
Right to that.
and run up the other side, which is now the driveway for 14 or 17 Lakeside Drive, whichever that big house is. It then went across what is Lakeside Drive now, up to meet Matheson Drive, and then continue on to Hebron Road. That was all one continuous West Street road. And you can still see where it comes out just north of what was John Gasper's house. I don't know who lives there now, but the Gasper the Gasper barn, then you had the farmhouse that John Gasper lived in, and very shortly from that, terrible English here, sorry. A little further up the road from there, you can see the two stone walls that go through. And if you look at Google Earth, you can try to see the stone walls run right through the woods where the road used to go. This was Jim Anderson's house until it burned last summer. It was built, though, as a corporation cottage, they called it. It was a store and real estate office, because when Andover Lake was built, it wasn't built to supply water to the Willimantic mills like a lot of people seem to think. It was built purely as an investment. The people invested, they bought all the land, they built the lake, they built the dam, created the lake, and then they were going to sell off all the lots. Well, in order to do that, you need a real estate office. So they built the real estate office. You could also go in there and get your supplies, because you had journeymen in those days bringing ice around and stuff. The lake didn't get electricity until the 1940s, even though it went down the center of Andover in 1926. But in those days, the power company didn't put wires just anywhere. They put them where there was going to be a return on their investment. So until there were enough cottages and people up at the lake, there was no power at the lake. But you still had all these cottages. So you would go here and get your supplies and your ice and things. I've got to get back up there now and take a picture. That's just a vacant lot now, unfortunately. Back to the Red Barn for a while. There was an awful lot that went on in the Red Barn. It's probably one of the more socially active buildings in town, maybe next to the old town hall. But this was just one of the many dinners that were in there. I remember more the bingos that went on there and a couple of dances. The dances were starting to dry up by the time I was able to remember, but I remember going to lots of bingos, Friday night bingos in that building. Watching the bats, dodging the Gano coming down. It was an experience. The old firehouse started out I've seen references that it started out as a schoolhouse on the grounds of the meeting house that was up on Route 316, Hebron Road. They said that because the Ecclesiastical Society was in charge of education in the 1700s. Wasn't a, well, basically it was, the church was in charge of it, as simple as that. But eventually the town became, the civic organizations became in charge of education. And what I understand is the frame of the old schoolhouse was dragged down and they built Sackett's store out of it. This is the other store I was referencing when we talked about the first store being for groceries and things like this. This was more for dry goods. You could see shovels and brooms, and there were dresses there, and if women wanted to get fitted for a bodice or whatever, you went upstairs and they had all kinds of different selections up there. The Mrs. Sackett would fit you. Alice Moe always used to talk about they had the best selection of ribbons for your hair upstairs as well. But ultimately in 1938 it became the firehouse. They basically gutted the whole basement area, put in the stone pillars, and that's how it started out. As it is right now, it had the two additions here, it had an addition out the back. It's been modified many, many times, and my understanding is very shortly it will be demolished. So,
Scott, is the original structure probably hand-hewn?
yes, definitely. There's definitely hand-hewn timbers in there.
That still exists in the firehouse today, upstairs?
Yes, there are instances where it's exposed and you can see it. How much is left there, I don't know, because as I said, they added on to the back, so I know all the timbers that are supporting the back roof are all modern, They added on to the side. There's 4 or 5 additions that went on in this.
What was the date of the original house, do you know? 18th century? 19th?
19th century, unless the story about the frame being the frame from the first school on the ecclesiastical property is true, then it probably drops into the 18. But that's one of the things I hope to be able to get a better answer for when they tear it down. If I can get in there and look at those timbers, we can probably figure out, because hand hewn in 1700s is different than hand hewn in 1800s. So, and the wood they're using and everything else. So, it very well, we might be able to answer that question more solidly, unless they just go in there with a grapple and take it all down and we don't get to look at it. But I put in the request. We'll have to see what the demolition actually looks like. Another house that still exists but not in town. This was called the Jack Hunt House. It was built 17, I don't know, did I put it on there? I guess I didn't. Early 1700s. It was built by a family that built the 2 big houses down here that are still on Route 6. Drawing a blank on the name. But anyhow, it was quite derelict in the 1950s, early 1950s. So they dismantled it and they took it to Basra. There was a lady there who wanted an old house, so they took it apart, took it down to Basra, refurbished it. When she died, 20 years later or so, she willed it to the Henry Ford Museum, and there it is sitting at the Henry Ford Museum now. If you ever go out there, though, you're going to see that it says it's from Coventry. Because keep in mind, when this was built, it was built in Coventry. Andover didn't exist as a town. Andover only existed as an ecclesiastical society.
Is it the Daggett house?
Yes, Daggett, that's the name I was looking for, sorry. Yes, but Daggett also built the ones down here on Route 6. He was a house right, but he built this one as his own personal house, as best I
The Clark house? The yellow, not that one.
don't believe so.
The, yeah, I don't know what's supposed to be built now.
The Wright House and, I'm terrible with names today, Goodman, John Goodman's house. 2 biggest houses in the center of town, very near Wales Road.
Going to Manchester on the left-hand side? Those,
Right-hand side going to Manchester.
so the white one that's owned.
The white one that's vacant, and then the sided one, the next one up, that they've got.
Not the yellow one that was owned by the Clarks.
It was yellow or yellowish, I think, yes.
Okay.
Somehow we went backwards here. Come on. Did I skip? Nope. All right, back on track, hopefully. Another fairly large house, long gone, was at the corner of Route 6 and Shoddy Mill Road. It was at various times used as a tea room. This was actually built by the second minister in town for the community church, Augustus Collins, I believe was his name. But over time, eventually Fred Case, the same guy who built the paper mill, bought it and turned it into an asylum, sanitarium, sorry, not asylum, sanitarium, basically treating people with tuberculosis. They believe that the water coming out of the pond up here that you can see a little bit of on Route 316 as you crest the hill, they thought that water had medicinal purposes. They brought it down to this house through lead pipes. It was probably the lead contamination that was the medicinal purposes, but anyhow, burned in 1925, roughly. Again, too close to the railroad tracks. Anything too close to the railroad tracks probably burned at one point or another. Come on. It's getting finicky. Another house that burned along the way, this was sitting right where the covered bridge goes over Hebron Road today. You can see the stonework that's still there. There's a little cottage out in the back, right next to my house. I'm over way up there. But all this stonework is what's right behind this house. And that sat right here in this little corner. But again, in the 1920s, along came a steam train and bye-bye house. But what I liked about this is it kind of demonstrates, you know, everybody has pristine lawns and yards. Most people do these days. Some people are going a la natural, but this is what yards were like in those days. You didn't have lawns. You just had spaces to get to your house. It was naturally taken care of. If you happen to have sheep or something, maybe they were eating this stuff down, but that's what yards looked like. And that's a nice family portrait out in front of the house. There's another one along Route 6. This is Merritt Valley Road. Route 6 now goes behind this. Again, this was before the WPA days. So you didn't have Route 6 going where it is now. Right now, Route 6 would have gone between this house and Catherine's barn. This was called the halfway house, not because it took care of people getting out of jail, but because it was halfway between Hartford and Norwich. We had the main road. Route 6 was the carriage road, or the stage road between Hartford and Norwich, two of the biggest settlements at the time. So halfway between Hartford and Norwich, you would stop, you could get off, you could go into the tavern, get a drink, get something to eat while they changed the horses. This is the tin barn that's there now. Originally there was a barn almost twice that size, burned because of the railroad. The reason there's a tin barn there now is because the railroad finally smartened up and said, if we're going to pay you to rebuild, you're going to have to rebuild with tin. So they put tin roofs on the houses along the railroad. They put tin, when they rebuilt the barn, it became a tin barn so that the next time the railroads, the engines came through, they wouldn't burn it down again. But anyways, this is what it looks like now. Again, Route 6 goes back here by the barn. This is Merritt Valley Road. It's the tree farm. There's also pictures where this was a car dealership at one point in time. They brought down Model Ts, I believe it was, on the railroad. They just drove them down here and put them up for sale. They had little signs on each of the trees that they were for sale. Actually, that's the picture right over there. You can see all those cars lined up for sale.
That's the foundation, the foundation you can see in the tree farm is from that house?
Yes. Not from the house per se, but off to this side, if you had a picture from the other end, you would see there's another structure protruding out of the front of what looks like it should have been the front rather than the side of the house. I believe it was like just an add-on, maybe a root cellar underneath probably and stuff like that. That's what you're seeing, but most of the foundation for the house itself is gone. But yes, it was connected to this structure. That little bit of stonework you still see. It's another beautiful house that burned, probably not due to the railroad, because this was quite a ways from it, but this is up right across from where Cider Mill Road, upper side of the Cider Mill Road nearest us. Kim Tabor's house sits on that lot now. That's Kim's. But that's a nice, beautiful Victorian house. If the railroad didn't burn them down, chances are the wood stove that you were using to heat and cook did burn them down. Unfortunately, it's amazing any of these old houses still exist today. Or another one that got burned, but this was a modern mistake. This house is right across from, if anybody's familiar with my grandfather's house, not far from Route 316 going east on Route 6. The main reason for this house, this is where the very first meeting of the Andover town took place. This is where they set up the first meeting to select the selectmen and other town officials. It was held in this house called the House House because Jonathan House owned it or built it. This is what it looked like up into the 1950s. Somewhere along the way, they took this off and that was gone, and exposed the barn part out and back. But that then burned in the 1980s. A gentleman came along Bought the house, was doing a lot of renovation, using a lot of linseed oil, packed up some rags and things in the garage, and I had just joined the fire department, and I was living in my grandfather's garage at the time. By the time we got the phone call and I got to the end of his driveway, which means I got dressed, got in my car, and went 100 feet, this thing was fully involved. By the time I got to the firehouse, got the truck, and came up, it was basically gone. So that's what's built in there now. The one-room schoolhouse that is still in town, this was the Northwest Schoolhouse. It was built on the Burnap Farm, right across the street from the Burnap House today on Burnap Brook Road. In this day, it was out by Route 6. So if you think of Burnap Brook Road and Route 6 intersection, this was on the west side of it, just sitting there. Yep.
That's where my son-in-law and daughter lived.
Yep. And then again,
Turn around and those columns.
yep, the columns are here. So this is the original house. As she said, it was picked up and moved much farther back toward the railroad now. But it started out right out on Route 6. It was built in 1848, same year we became a town. It replaced an existing building. But because of the connection to the Burnups and the money from the Burnup family, it was a very substantial one-room schoolhouse, much bigger than all the other ones in town, and much fancier with the columns and things. But as I said, it's the only one left in town. 2 others burned and 1 was taken away to a museum. So this is the only one left out of the 4 districts. And by one-room schoolhouse, we basically mean, grades 1 through 8, which is all generally education was in those days, went to this. So everybody in that quarter of the town went to here. Didn't matter what grade you were in. There were 4 different one-room schoolhouses. After that, if you were going to go on, which again didn't always happen, you would go down to Natchog High School in Willimantic. And to do that, you would get on the train, go down there, get your school day, get on a train, and come back. This is the other one-room schoolhouse that was in existence when I was, again, a kid. This was right at the end of Lake Road, when it used to tee into Merritt Valley Road before it was put through. This was used as a residence for a while. The Merritts lived there. Now it's just a vacant lot. This building was taken down piece by piece and taken off to a museum somewhere, like a Sturbridge Village, but nobody can tell me which one, and I haven't been able to find it online. So if anybody ever sees a picture of this or something, let me know, please. But that's more typical. That's about half the size of the one-room schoolhouse we were just looking at, and that's much more typical of the schools. Andover, by the way, was the first town in the state to consolidate its schools, meaning bring all the first graders together in one place, all the 8th graders together in one place. That happened in 1888. We were the first ones in the state to do that. This is the one non-building I put in here, just for ha-has. The original World War II memorial was just this wooden plaque in front of the library. Eventually, in the 1960, the Grange got this nice granite monument put together, which included the Korean War veterans as well as the World War II veterans. And ultimately, they brought together all the stones. I believe in about 1992, I think these were brought together. They took the Revolutionary War, Civil War, War of 1812 stone that used to be down on the front lawn of the church, if anybody ever remembers it down there prior to 1960. Yeah. It sat on the corner, very close, Long Hill Road and Route 6, sat in the front yard. The Vietnam era stone was up on Hebron Road between the 2 ends of Center Street when it was first brought to town. And then again, this World War II Korean War monument that was originally sitting over where I showed you earlier, that vacant lot right across from the museum now. And you can see the top stone, again, that was from the Baptist church. Actually, both of these were from the Baptist church. This stone without the plaque, because somebody liberated the plaque over the years, is now at the museum. Another business that used to be in town, that package store went through many, many hands over the years. It was Mendenhall's at one time. There was numerous people that owned the gas station next door. This is the gas station. This is Du Bois, for anybody who's questioning where that is. It's right between Du Bois and the commuter lot. That was taken down because the commuter lot kind of comes right into here in this building. But that's what's left of it. That little concrete edge is the foundation. I believe that was Koval's when that picture was taken. But again, a lot of different people ran that. Ultimately, at the end, it was actually a balloon shop. Ken's Garage was around for 100 years. He came back from World War II, decided he didn't like working for Pratt & Whitney, which he had been doing before he went off to the war. Decided he wanted to build a garage, so he went down here to ABC Concrete, which was a local business down on Indy Road, started bringing a pickup truckload of blocks to this spot over the years. And he started out, he built just the office first so that he could start selling gasoline right away, help pay for it, and then ultimately he built the garage part on it. He sold it off, it became Andover Auto Parts. Then ultimately Andover Auto Parts moved back where they are now, and the Extra Mart built their complex right in the same spot. And the last one here, this is just showing you what some of the damage the 38 hurricane did around town. Took down a lot of trees, closed a lot of roads and things, but it did also take out the steeple on the church. Luckily, it didn't do a lot more damage, but also, as I said, it took out a lot of the dams around as well. No real damage to the Andover Lake Dam, as far as I know, but a lot of the smaller dams that were on the minor brooks, especially the older ones, you know, the abandoned dams that hadn't been kept up, were taken out and pretty much destroyed.